missiles will hit the mosque and clear the place for the third Bet HaMikdash. If it was up to me, the last time when they shot hundreds of missiles, I would pretend that one missile came from Iran and shoot it down. And all the Arabs will go against Iran, and it will be the end of the problems.
So, again, this may be confusing to you as to who these people are, why they are saying these things. All right, but now what I'm going to do is explain to you what is really going on, okay? And I keep on saying this, but it is hard from a geopolitical perspective to explain this US-Iran war. You have to look at the religious perspective, okay? The religious angle, and that's what I want to focus on today. This is the three holiest sites in the Islamic world. This is Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina, and this is Dome of the Rock, the Aqsa Mosque, which is where Muhammad was supposed to ascend to heaven. And the Jews and the Christian Zionists believe that this must be destroyed so that they can build the third temple, or Solomon's temple. So this is the big question in this war. If they do not destroy the Aqsa Mosque, and if they are able to achieve peace, then my predictive model, my analysis is completely wrong, and you just ignore me, okay, for the rest of my life. All right, so let us examine why this is important, okay? So today I want to introduce you to a new theory of game theory called the law of eschatological convergence. Okay, so this is a very hard thing to write down, okay? It sounds complicated, but it's not, okay? Eschatology, what it is a story of how the world ends. And it's very it's very compelling for people because, remember, we discussed this last semester, but as human beings, we have three questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? And eschatology provides a story that answers all three questions. Why God created us, what our mission on earth is, and what God has planned for the end of the world. Okay? And different traditions will have different eschatologies. And what's important to figure out is, in what aspect do these eschatologies converge? Okay? Converge, meaning a union of these eschatologies. And why is that important? Because it allows you to predict how they will behave. Think of a story as the operating system of a society. And as such, it's a script that they will act out. And if you're able to figure out the different scripts and see how they converge together, where the union of these different scripts are, then you can actually predict how the world will turn out. So, having explained the law, I'm going to go into some theory to help us understand why this works, okay? All right, so the first thing to understand is something called the universal law of game theory. And the universal law of game theory states this: whoever wins a game is able to do this, okay? Mass times energy times coordination, okay? So these are the three things you want to look at to understand how well a player would do in a game. So mass is just the number of people involved on the team, okay? Energy is just how much attention, focus, motivation there is, okay? So think of it as attention or action, okay? Any of these words will do. But basically, how invested are you in winning the game? How hard are you willing to work to win the game? And coordination is just the idea of synchronicity. And what I mean by that is, how well do the teammates work together? And something that you need to appreciate is that the most important thing in winning a game is actually coordination. In fact, I would say it's 4 times more important than just mass. So you can have a lot of people, but if they don't work well together, you're defeated by another team with few people, but they work well together, okay? And then energy is twice as important as mass. So let me give you an example. Let's just say that you're playing a game by yourself, okay? Maybe for example, you enter a ping pong competition or a chess competition. Well, mass and coordination don't really matter because you don't have any teammates. And so what matters is energy, how motivated you are to win this game. How much time do you put into studying and improving yourself? How focused are you in winning, okay? What's interesting is that there are different ways to improve or increase, augment the energy and coordination. So maybe a leader, okay? So maybe if someone is a really inspiring leader, that will make people much more motivated. That will allow them to work well together because all they have to do is listen to a leader. Then you have a family, okay, blood. But we cannot account for the differences within this family, okay, the conflict within this family, right? So historically, in the long term, the force that allows teams to beat other teams is the idea of narrative or a story. Why? Because it implants in the minds of all those who believe in the narrative a series of actions that they must take in order to win the game. Okay? So think of it as a script. And in a script, you know what part you play, so you just have to act it out. And that allows for you all to work together to achieve the outcome that you desire. Okay? And in narrative, the most powerful form of narrative is the idea of eschatology. Because eschatology is a complete script in which everyone knows what he or she must do in order to achieve the desired outcome. And eschatology also is able to transcend both time and space, meaning that you can actually spend centuries acting out the script because everyone knows his role anyway. You can go beyond ethnic identity and family, okay? Right? So I'm gonna go into the idea of eschatological convergence. Because once we know the different eschatologies and we know how they converge together, we can actually make certain predictions about how this war will progress. Okay, so the first major eschatology I want to look at is called Zoroastrianism. And this is the first eschatology. It's an eschatology of the Persian Empire, okay? And this eschatology is very simple. In the world, there's truth and a lie, okay? The light and the darkness. And it is our responsibility as humans to live for the light, to die for the truth against the lie. And at the end of days, there will be a final battle and a day of judgment, okay? So light versus dark, and then you have a day of judgment. Okay, where the God, our master, will come down and he will create a paradise for everyone. Okay, so what matters is to live a noble life and await the day of judgment where eventually heaven on earth will manifest. Okay, and this is important because if you think about how the Iranians are fighting this war, the Iranians refuse to take the initiative and destroy too much, okay? They refuse to be the villains in this war because for them, in their eschatology, it's important to die for the light, to fight for the truth, okay? Now, Zoroastrianism has a major impact on Jewish eschatology, okay? And Jewish eschatology, again, I'm only talking about the most extreme version of this eschatology, okay? And in this eschatology, the idea is that the Jews disobeyed God, okay? Disobedience. And in order to repair the world, to save themselves, to create heaven on earth, they need to engage in redemption. And redemption is really about spiritual alchemy, improving yourself as a person, being good to yourself, being good to others, loving your neighbor as though you would love yourself. Okay, that's a mainstream idea. But in the most extreme version, redemption just means acting out God's plan to compel the return of the Messiah. Okay, and this plan is basically create Israel, return Jewish diaspora, build third temple, and this will often called the War of Gog and Magog. And then when the Jews are most threatened, the Messiah will come to save them from their enemies. And this will create something called the Messianic age, okay? When God rules over the earth through his Messiah, who comes from the house of David. Okay, all right. So again, this is a simple version. There are lots of different versions. This is the most simple version for our purposes, okay? Now, what's interesting is that this Jewish eschatology would go on to influence the Protestants, okay? And this creates a movement called Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism, so the technical word for Christian Zionism is called premillennial dispensationalism. Okay? And this sounds very complicated, but it's not. All it means is that God has a plan for how to create heaven on earth. And we have a duty to fulfill his plan by following his instructions. Okay? All right. So what Christian Zionism is doing is that it takes this Jewish eschatology and makes certain changes to it. Okay? So, for example, the first change that it makes is, okay, this plan is fine, but rather than say that the Jewish Messiah is the representative of God, what they say is that, no, he's actually the representative of Satan, okay? So the Messiah in the Jewish tradition becomes the Antichrist in the Christian Zionist tradition. And why is this important? It's important because for the Christians, the Messiah must be Jesus, okay? So the Messiah, so the Antichrist, what he does is that he rules over the world. He's very charismatic and he rules the world in Jerusalem. And he starts the war of Gog and Magog in order to conquer the world and destroy the Jews. At this point, Jesus will return to save God's chosen people, the Jews. And when Jesus returns, there'll be something called the rapture, where all Christians will immediately ascend to heaven, okay? So the rapture, okay? So again, Christian Zionism is working off Jewish eschatology, but it's making some important changes, okay? So another way of saying this is, in the beginning, Zionists and Christian Zionists will work together to reach a certain point of history, okay, what we call the Great Israel Project, but then they will diverge and fight against each other. So they're allies now, but eventually they'll turn against each other. All right, so now I want to talk about the Freemasons. Because the Freemasons, we'll talk more about the Freemasons later, okay? The Freemasons are also working within the Christian Zionist context, but they are much more focused on actually how to implement this, okay? So what they want to do is they want to take the Antichrist and turn it into a system. And this system we discussed last semester, it's called Pax Judaica. What is Pax Judaica? Pax Judaica is that Israel controls the world through AI, okay, an AI surveillance state, okay? And Pax Judaica, the AI surveillance state, will have things such as the mark of the beast. And what is the mark of the beast? It is digital ID, okay? And this digital ID will also lead to digital currency. And they can actually put a microchip or a QR bar in your forehead, and this will be considered the mark of the beast, okay? And it's all part of the Christian Zionist eschatology. Another really important thing about the Freemasons is the idea of a one world government. Because remember, the Antichrist is the leader of a one world government, and it'll be based in Jerusalem, okay? And so the headquarters will be Solomon's temple, or the third temple. And then you have the Islamic eschatology, okay? Islamic eschatology is a response to all these other eschatologies, where they say that when the system is created, it'll be called Dajjal, the Antichrist, okay? And when this happens, then Jesus will return to defeat the Antichrist. Okay, that's the mainstream Islamic eschatology. Then you have the Shia, okay? The Shia, are the Iranians. It will be the 12th Imam Mahdi who will lead the followers, okay? The Ummah, okay? Ummah just means community of believers, into victory against the Antichrist, the Dajjal, okay? So you can see how these eschatologies are basically lining up together, right? The Shia are the Iranians. The Islamic is the entire Arab world. Another eschatology that's very important is the Catholic eschatology. And the Catholic eschatology we can call City of God, okay? Which is the church, which is Jerusalem. And St. Augustine talks about this, about how the Catholic Church, it is the millennium. It is the Messianic age because we represent God and we bring peace and prosperity to the world. What's important about the church is that it became the dominant power in the world because Rome fell. Okay? So Roman Empire collapses, but this is all part of God's divine plan because Roman Empire, Rome, was the city of earth, okay, of power, of money, of wealth. And what matters is Jerusalem, the city of God, of spirituality, of divinity, okay? Now, the city of God came to an end because of the rise of the Protestants and the Anglo-American Empire. So for the Catholic Church to achieve its eschatology and establish again the city of God, what they need to do is also see the Anglo-American Empire destroyed just like the Roman Empire, okay? So that is the Catholic eschatology. The last eschatology I want to discuss is the Orthodox eschatology. And what's the Orthodox eschatology? The Russians, okay? And this is called the third Rome prophecy. Okay? The third Rome prophecy is basically that Moscow will become the third Rome. Okay, the first Rome was Rome, second Rome was Constantinople, the third Rome will be Moscow. And also what's really important to appreciate is that there will be no fourth Rome. So when Moscow becomes a third Rome, history ends. Okay, and peace and prosperity will come to the world. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that Russia will unite the Orthodox world. Okay, so right now the Orthodox world is split into Eastern Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy. Okay, and something that is very important that this prophecy says is that the Russians will defeat Turkey in a war and then have the Greeks return to Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. Okay, that's what the prophecy says. And so you look at all these different eschatologies, okay? And again, guys, this is the majority of the world, right? If you actually look at the convergence points, you come to some startling conclusions, okay? So let's look at the convergence, right? Where do they converge? Well, first of all, okay, where they converge is that the greater Israel project will be achieved, okay? Pax Judaica will be achieved. It's the one world government, okay? One world government. That is one major convergence. If that's true, then another convergence is the Aqsa Mosque will give way to the third temple. All these eschatologies either say this or are indifferent to saying this, okay? They're not opposed to this, all right? So that's why I predict the Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed because they need to build a third temple. Another thing in which they converge is the rise of anti-Semitism. Why? Because that will force the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, to return to Israel. This is very important for this eschatology, okay? All right. Another important convergence point is the war of Gog and Magog. We don't actually know what this is, but this war is supposed to be the final war before the return of God, before the end of history, before the end of the world, okay? What this war is, we don't know yet. But another thing is that this war in Iran will lead to the war of Gog and Magog at some point. Another thing that's very important is US and China are not part of this eschatology, okay? This is where everyone agrees. For whatever reason, the United States is not going to partake in future events. Neither will China, which means that something will happen to these two countries that will make them not significant anymore, okay? And the best prediction for the United States then is civil war. And this is where all these eschatologies converge. So in other words, this war in Iran is happening so that these different eschatological traditions can achieve heaven on earth from their perspective.